There's a lot that goes into making a painting. For example, the one I'm currently working on right here has a lot of nuances, lots of plants and foliage. But the previous one had a different challenge. It was a lot of clouds in the sky. Hello and welcome. My name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And in today's video, I am going to talk about how I painted the sky in the background. Full disclosure, I do not consider myself an expert at painting clouds, but that's not going to stop me from showing you how I did them in my painting. I just wanted to get that out of the way. There were some parts that were very easy and others that were quite difficult. More on that a little later. This is the reference photo that I used. It's not just clouds. There are poppies in it and also other plants. That's why the first step I took was doing a underpainting, particularly in acrylic, because the paint dries quickly and it allowed me to lay out the foundation of where everything is. The first thing I started to work on was the background, particularly the sky and the clouds that were in it. It made sense to go that route because after all, the plants and poppies are in front of all the clouds and sky. But I did do touch-ups at the very end, which I will talk about during the demonstration. But I want to point out one important cloud in this painting. This one right here. It was by far one of the hardest ones to do. That cloud had lots of curves and slight changes of color, and I had to keep reworking it until it looked right. Once again, that will be something I will talk more about during the demonstration. Anyhow, before we start, let me show you the paints I used. In order to do the sky, I used 3 different blues. They were French ultramarine for the very top, cobalt blue for the middle, and lastly, cerulean blue for the very bottom. All 3 of these blues were mixed with titanium white, with practically none towards the top and quite a bit towards the bottom with cerulean blue. Speaking of the bottom, it also had a tiny bit of cadmium orange as well. Yes, this tube has seen better days. And as for the clouds themselves, depending on the location, I used these 3 blues mixed with titanium white. And to get some of the purple or violet tones, I used alizarin crimson mixed with either cobalt blue or French ultramarine. That is how I got the violet light that was underneath the clouds. More on that in the demonstration. Oh yeah, I forgot. There is one more color I used. It was actually Viridian. I used a tad bit of this green mixed with alizarin crimson to get a very dark black, more so on the red spectrum. After that, I used this mixture to make gray with titanium white, and then depending on the cloud or lighting, I would use blues to make it cooler, or alizarin crimson for a little bit of warmth. These are the 7 main colors I used for making the sky, in case you wanted to know. Anyhow, without any further delay, let's get on with the demonstration. I start off with a underpainting. I use a grid to help me place the clouds in the right spot, as well as some of the plants that will be in the foreground. I'm using acrylic paint because it dries quickly, and it's very important to note I'm not too focused with detail, at least not just yet, or even the exact color. I'm just focusing on lights and darks and building a sense of volume for the clouds, all in preparation for the oil that will come next. Now it is time to apply the oil. I let the acrylic dry for at least 1 day. The last thing you want to do is mix oil with acrylic paint that's not fully dry. Anyhow, I start painting the sky by applying blue. I mixed several batches ahead of time with different tones from top to bottom. I wanted to have a little extra paint just in case I needed to touch up the clouds. Plus, it'll be necessary for dry brushing later. But right now, all I'm trying to do is apply a uniform blue from left to right. You will notice I'm not painting carefully around the clouds or the plants. That's because the fine tuning will come later when I'm doing the foreground. And the clouds, of course. Oh, and the red poppies. Something tells me they will be important later. But something I want to take advantage of is the dry time of oil. It stays wet for a very long time. And this will be very helpful later when you want to have that nice soft effect with clouds. But this doesn't mean to take your time. It is very crucial to take advantage of the oil paint while it is still wet. More on that later. Anyhow, once I applied the blues, I tried to smooth out the borders with dry brushing and tried to make it a seamless transition from top to bottom. Take a note on how it is pretty dark on the top, but more pale on the bottom. Now it is time to paint the clouds. Spoiler alert, the main color I will be using is titanium white, but it will be several variations. Depending on the location, I will be using some alizarin crimson, cobalt blue, or ultramarine blue. That will be for mostly the darker areas. But for the bright spots, it will be mostly titanium white with either a tad bit of cadmium yellow or cadmium orange. The way I apply the variations of white is based on how the sunlight is shaping out the clouds. Clouds are not just white patches of circles in the sky. They have volume, and in many cases, they are huge. But it is the sun and the light that helps shape them out. So definitely pay attention to the lights and darks. One of the things I do while painting the clouds is introduce blue from the sky as I paint them. This is in order to reshape the clouds or cut out parts of them so the sky is visible. But another reason is because the clouds are not always opaque. Sometimes they are kind of see-through and very thin. My painting strategy for the clouds is very simple. For the majority of the time, I apply the appropriate whites that I see, in a way, patches of color. Instead of switching back and forth to different colors of white, I try to use the same tone wherever I see it. I pay attention also to the edges of the clouds. Some are actually very crisp and very dense, therefore they stand out more. Others are soft and dissolve into the sky. When I feel that I have the right tones at the right spots, I use a dry brush to gently blend and make smooth transitions from one color to the other. It is important to note, this is not going to be the case all the time. There will be parts of the clouds that are going to have more distinguishable features. It will come down to that particular cloud's shape, but I will touch bases more on that later. But for the beginning stages of cloud building, it will be mostly softer transitions. The goal is really to set the clouds where they are, have the right colors in the right spots, and shape them out the way you want. And in my case, somewhat close to the reference photo. Pay also attention to some of the clouds that are broken apart. Sometimes there are some stray little bits, and sometimes there's also streaks of them. Capturing them in your painting will add to the overall realism. And it's pretty simple, especially if the blue in your sky is still wet. To create little bits of broken pieces of clouds, simply just dab little dots of the correct white color that you see, and then dry brush it. Gently use your brush in a way to diffuse the paint into the blue. But if you want to make some streaks of clouds, same process in a way. Make a line of white and then gently dry brush it. It helps to have a wavy motion as you dry brush. That way the white mixes with the blue gently, softening the edge of the cloud where the sky meets it. You will also notice that there are some clouds that are barely there. They are almost like ghosts. Just like the little bits of broken clouds and the streaky ones, they add to the overall realism. They are quite simple to do, just like the other ones. Dab a little paint, but during the dry brushing process, spread the paint even more. A helpful tip is to mix some whites with the appropriate blues that match that section of the sky. Now this is just one of the clouds that I am working on in this painting. It is also definitely the easier of the two. So I'm going to speed through this part and sum up the process a bit. I continue to build up the clouds by applying the different tones of whites that I see. At the same time, I'm also applying some of the blue from the sky. I'm also trying to use different tones of lights and darks in order to shape them out. Even though clouds have a soft appearance, I think of the process kind of like sculpting, but instead using a paintbrush to chisel away the shapes and curves and features that I see. Again, lights and darks help do this. But I'm also paying attention to the edges. I'm looking at the photo periodically and soften some parts with dry brushing, but at the same time making parts of the clouds more dense and more distinguishable as well, with somewhat harder edges, especially the areas where there's some sunlight or the clouds are pretty dense. I also vary the way I apply the paint. Sometimes I just apply it with a brush stroke, other times I apply the paint by gently dabbing it, kind of like applying some powder. But dry brushing is probably the technique I use the most when creating the clouds. Now, on to some more difficult clouds to do. I start off with the cloud on the far right. For the most part, it is just a dark gray lavender, but there are some bright spots. As I apply the paint, I'm being very careful to make sure the plants from the underpainting are still visible in both the sections where the sky is and also the clouds. Later I will come back and do the plants, but right now I am just focusing on the sky and the clouds. But at the same time, I am creating an outline for the plants so they stand out a little more and don't get lost. It is hard to tell from the reference photo, but this cloud is very huge. But it is also pushed back into the distance, so it's gonna have quite a soft touch to it overall. And the cloud a little bit to the bottom left is definitely gonna stand out way more. Also, because the sun is hidden more on the right of that cloud and only the left part is really visible, I am using mostly cool tones of white, mostly mixed with cobalt blue or even alizarin crimson to get a lavender-like violet. And because this cloud is really in the distance, I'm trying to not make it stand out too much. So as I paint the features and curvature, the contrast is not going to be too much between the lights and darks, except for the areas where there's direct sunlight. But I definitely paid attention to the photo very carefully, and in some scenarios exaggerated the colors to help create the sense of volume that the cloud had. But at the same time, I tried to be very subtle. I even used more of the blue from the sky in order to help push it back more into the distance. Now for the cloud in the bottom left. One thing you'll notice, it is way brighter and also the edges are a lot crisper. I am still using a soft edge between the cloud and the sky, but in certain areas, it's very subtle. Instead of using a dry brush to soften the edge, I actually used the blue that I made for that section of the sky. I apply it around the cloud and then gently brush it in to where the white is to give the cloud a soft edge. There's also some clouds on the right of it that kind of disappear into the sky. I apply some paint and then I dry brush it away and make it dissolve into the blue. They are very faint pieces of the cloud that broken away. As I paint them, the goal is for them to barely be visible. Now time to paint the cloud in the middle. This by far was the most complicated of all the clouds that I painted. To make things even more difficult, there were also two poppies right in the middle of it, as well as some plants too. But the thing that made it the most challenging to paint was all the bumps and curves. Getting the overall shape and curvature of this cloud required quite a lot of trial and error. With that said, don't be ashamed if you have to constantly repaint certain sections until they look right. Think of painting as a learning process and you can constantly correct your mistakes. Anyhow, to do this cloud, it's the same process. I tried to apply the right colors in the right spots and I used the lights and darks to give the cloud shape and form. But something that I approached differently versus the other clouds is the bottom. This cloud extends beyond into the horizon and it covers quite a bit of distance, and because of that, there is an unusual reflective light visible above the hills in the background. It appears to be a light gray lavender. But before the cloud transitions into that color, there is a very dark blue. Overall, this cloud has quite a bit of contrast, and even though it was the most difficult to paint, it was also the most fun. I had to look at the photo very carefully to be able to distinguish every curve. In some sections it was very subtle, and in others, the transition from light to dark was very dramatic. I did use extensive dry brushing in this area. A lot of the times it was with a tiny brush. Just like some of the other clouds, I also used the blue from the sky to not only soften the edges of the cloud, but also to correct and reshape it. I used an even deeper blue for some of the areas that were very dark. Some of the bumps and curves stood out quite a bit in those areas as well. And because of that, I didn't dry brush as much. I would soften the edges, but not make a nice transition from one color to the other. The cloud was definitely way more bumpy, and I had to show that in my painting. Near the top, there were streaks of clouds. Just like before, I applied lines of paint, and then I dry brushed them into the sky, with the goal to make the edges as soft as possible. Now this was definitely the most difficult area to paint in the cloud. Initially, I was trying to be as careful as possible to paint between the poppies. But then towards the end, I kind of gave up. I figured I could always repaint the plants, but in order to get smooth transitions from one color to the other, I had to paint over parts of the underpainting. The strategy was the same: apply the colors I see, try to shape out the cloud with the lights and darks, and then dry brush away. But I had to do something very important in this scenario, and that was to work on the hills a bit. Sadly, I do not have footage of how I did the sections of where the hills met the sky, but I will explain how I did it. They were definitely the most blurry thing in the photo, and I wanted to keep it that way in the painting as well. But right now, since I was working on the clouds that were above them, it was a good opportunity to correct them. I used the colors of the clouds and sky in order to kind of reshape the hills and try to define some of the trees as well. And like before, I did some dry brushing. In order to give the illusion of depth and distance, things in the back have to have soft edges. The hills are actually not that far away. That is also why they're not too pale, and I didn't use too much blue from the sky to make them. But as I painted the border of where the clouds met the hills, I mixed a few greens in order to paint those sections of the hills, and then dry brush in the tree line in order to help create the illusion of depth. As for the lighting that's underneath the clouds, it was not one solid transition from one color to the other. The cloud was not exactly flat underneath. It probably had bumps and crevices. That's why I tried using lights and darks underneath in order to help distinguish those shapes. They definitely did not stand out like the curvature in the sunlight. They were instead more subtle and very blurry. This now is a close-up of one of the most difficult sections to paint. As mentioned before, I was trying to be very careful when it came to trying to not paint over the plants or poppies. But in order to get a nice transition between colors, I had to paint over a few. As long as I had an idea of where the plants were, I would be fine. But right now, it was more important to get the clouds right first. Besides all the obstacles that the plants created, there were a lot of intricate details in the cloud. I also liked the reflective light that was underneath the cloud. It was also broken down in many segments. Each one was depicted by the slightest change of color, as well as lights and darks. I will be honest, I made lots of mistakes painting this area, just like the rest of the painting, but I kept painting, either reworking the clouds by reshaping them, or introducing other colors. And of course, dry brushing again. The right amount, that is. In some areas, instead of just dry brushing, I applied paint in a directional kind of way to mimic pieces of the cloud, kind of like painting fur on an animal to a certain extent. Because clouds, they are not ultra smooth. They have texture, some more than others. The bottom left section of the sky was definitely the easiest part to paint, thanks to dry brushing, that is. Besides some of the highlights on the bottom left cloud, most of it dissolves into the horizon. This was also an opportunity to touch up the sky blue as well. Towards the bottom, it is more light and has some warm tones as well. While the top had mostly ultramarine and cobalt blue, the bottom was mostly cerulean, with a tad bit of cadmium orange and titanium white, of course. As I applied the sky color, once again I dry brush it to make the transition from top to bottom more smoother, and also reshape the cloud as well. This was also a good opportunity to paint some more broken stray clouds, as well as the ones that appear very faintly in the sky, almost like ghosts. To paint them, it's very easy. Just apply paint and then dry brush until they blend into the sky and fade away. Now at the very bottom far end, there is another cloud that barely is there. In a way, it envelopes the poppy. Even though it is very blurry in the photo, there are definitely some details to try to capture, such as the reflective light underneath the cloud and the bumps and curvature. But I'm not trying to make this cloud stand out. It is only part of the background after all. So despite trying to capture some of the lights and darks, I tried to keep the overall contrast minimal. Once again, I relied on dry brushing as well to smooth out the edges and make them soft like a cloud. Sorry, this pun was actually intended. As I'm painting the cloud, I'm using the blue from the sky to reshape it as well. And since the paint from the cloud is still wet, as I'm painting the sky, my brush strokes get as close as possible to the edges of where the sky meets the cloud, and then gently blending the colors together, helping create a nice soft edge of where the cloud meets the sky, and at the same time helping establish a sense of depth and distance. Something I did not film, once again, was mixing a batch of greens in order to reshape the hills and tree line. But just like before, I took the opportunity while the paint of the cloud was still wet to not only reshape the hills and tree line, but also to create a nice soft edge of where the two meet. In the end, the stars of this painting will definitely be the poppies. So the goal was to push things into the distance like the clouds and hills so they could stand out in the end. That is why soft blurry edges help. The flowers will definitely have crisper edges, but I'm saving how I did them for a different video. Anyhow, back to the clouds. Something I want to point out that was in a way an error on my part was having to repaint the sky. I did not film the entire process of making this painting, but I did capture this section. Sometimes when you stand back, you notice something is off. And for me, it had to do with using several different blues. Therefore, I remixed a blue for that portion of the sky, and at the same time took advantage of reshaping some of the clouds. This also involved touching up some of the edges, but at least I didn't repaint the sky 4 times like I did with my sheep painting. Something I haven't done up until now was go extremely bright. It is a somewhat hidden rule in painting that it is good to do midtones first and then extreme darks and then at the very end extreme lights. This rule is not set in stone, but I have to say it is helpful, especially when you're trying to sculpt something like a cloud and show shape, volume, and mass, and even texture. Lights and darks definitely help. This is why I am starting to apply very bright highlights. I'm not too worried about refining them just yet. The goal is to identify where the lights are. Plus, this is also a tug-of-war battle with me. I didn't want the extreme lights and extreme darks to stand out too much. If they did, they would overpower the poppies later. That is also why I would dry brush almost immediately to soften the edges between the lights and darks, as well as where the cloud met the sky. In this stage of the painting, parts of the cloud was also dry, but that's okay. You can still get a soft edge when you apply wet paint over dry. Just use a dry brush, like usual, but just spread the paint a little bit thin over the area that is dry. But in some scenarios, you might have to mix color again if you don't have any already made. It doesn't have to be an exact color, just as close as possible. I'm going to speed through this section because really it's more of the same. But one important thing I want to point out are the highlights. This is due to the direct sunlight. For the most part, I was using lots of thin layers, but not for the extreme brights. I want them to stand out a bit. So for the parts that the sun is hitting the cloud pretty directly, creating extreme lights, I'm not afraid to use very thick titanium white with a tad bit of cadmium orange. Those two colors do a great job amplifying the brightness of the sun, especially on clouds and in snow, but this is a cloud painting. Anyhow, in this stage of the painting, my focus is to refine everything I have done, whether it is the color, the contrast, or even the edges. Some of the clouds definitely did have more defined edges because of the sunlight. During this stage, I also smoothed out areas, especially parts of the clouds that looked kind of painterly. Not that I was trying to avoid texture, but too much in certain areas, especially for the clouds that are more in the distance, is a bad thing. Especially if you're trying to pull off the illusion of depth and distance. Now it is time to slow down a bit, because this is the most important part of the painting process, and also the most boring, might I add. That is the touch-ups. As you can see, this plant is actually fully rendered. I was not too satisfied with the inconsistencies with the sky, so I went back and actually repainted the dark blues. During this stage, I went darker on the top, but besides that, the goal was to create a better smooth transition from one color to the other. And that involved painting very carefully around the plants. Yes, I painted between each thorn, and there's many times when I had to repaint the thorns. During this time, one of the problems I endured was the green from the plant bleeding into the sky. I tried to remedy this situation by applying more of the sky blue and doing my best to try to blend it away with a dry brush. But at the same time, repainting the sky gave me the opportunity to sharpen and thin out some of the thorns on the plant. It is also hard to tell, but another thing I did was use some of the blue to soften the bulb of that plant where some of the thorns met the sky. Some other notable touch-ups I did towards the end was to further enhance some of the highlights. I did stare at my painting for a little bit, and I came to the conclusion that I dulled out some of them too much with dry brushing. So for them to stand out a little bit more, I was a little bit more direct with my brush strokes and didn't bother to smooth them out too much. And also, just like the sky, I took this time to use some of the color that I mixed for the clouds and sharpen and thin out some of the thorns that were on the stem. And like before, I had to repaint some of them too, regardless of how careful I was. Something that I did film, but it is not in this video, is how the red from the poppies bled into the clouds. It happened when I tried to reshape the poppies. The red was still wet, and I tried to apply some white around them, and because of that, I created a little pink halo. But to fix the problem, all I had to do was wait for the paint to dry and then fix the edges by making the edges of the poppies more sharp so they stood out against the background. Even though I spent a great deal of time doing the clouds, the poppies are the stars in the end, and nothing like some sharper edges to make them stand out. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it. Hopefully you found this video very helpful and it helps you when you paint clouds the next time. Anyhow, for more of my work, check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. Anyhow, stay tuned for my next painting. Once again, my name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. Until next time, bye.